Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're here to discuss the stories by which we deeply live. Let's talk about American Gnosis, a form of experience-based spirituality that's unique to the United States. Let me give you a couple of quotations to start us off. The first one is, "Stand there, balked and dumb, stuttering and stammering, hissed and hooted. Stand and strive, until at last rage draw out of thee that dream power, which every night shows thee is thine own. A power transcending all limit and privacy, and by virtue of which a man is the conductor of the whole river of electricity." That was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Here's the second. "I cannot be an optimist, but I am a prisoner of hope." That's Cornel West. Both of these feel very American to me, although for different reasons. Emerson's words feel very willful and exuberant, which is characteristic not only of Emerson, but I think our whole culture. And so is the longing for hope that you hear in Cornel West. The tradition I'm referring to, American Gnosis, goes very far back in time. And I want to tell you a little bit about it because I think it's important to understand it if you're to understand what it really means to be an American, what it really means to be here deeply in the United States. It's something that most of us here have forgotten. And that forgetting explains some of our rootlessness and unhappiness and unwillingness to listen to each other. We have a common tradition that's been hiding in plain sight, a way of feeling truly rooted here, a true sense of belonging here. But most of us don't know anything about it. So, American Gnosis, what about that word gnosis? K-N-O-S-I-S. What does that mean? So it starts life as a Greek word for knowing. It's one of a few Greek words that mean to know. But down through the centuries, gnosis takes on a deeper meaning. When you understand a dream deeply all of a sudden, or when something about the pattern of your life suddenly makes sense to you, or when you have a peak experience, or one of those moments where you feel like you're in touch with the world itself, or even the cosmos. Those are moments of gnosis. Those are moments of deep knowing. It's sometimes defined as direct spiritual experience. It's a knowing that's very experience-based. It's not instrumental. It's not so much a knowing about how to do something like driving a car, as a knowing about how you are, how to be. Those are examples of gnosis. So this tradition of American Gnosis is a way of knowing deeply, a way of understanding that we're in a great conversation with all the things around us, that we belong here. And it's a form of spirituality that goes all the way back to indigenous spirituality on our section of this continent. So let's start there. Now there's this trope that goes around about American Indian spirituality, and of course it's different from tribe to tribe. The rituals are different. The backgrounds are different. The creation stories are different. But one of the things that Indigenous people notice when they get together are the overlaps, the similarities. And the trope that goes around non-native people is that this form of spirituality is archaic, that it is restricted to the past, that it's somehow primitive, that it's superstitious, and it was just a form of ignorance until Christianity came along. None of those statements are true. Like any spirituality, American indigenous spirituality has been in continual evolution throughout its lifespan, which in the case of that form of spirit reaches back who knows how many thousands of years. And it's deeply wedded to the land, to the natural world. So that's a root of what I'm calling American Gnosis. And what I'm describing to you is not an evolution. It's more like the currents in a mighty river. Each of the currents matters on its own. So there's no idea or claim here that the currents are going to get lost in the river or that the river is better than the currents or anything like that. It's more a matter of unity in diversity, which I think is absolutely core to the experience of being an American, whether we're conscious of it or not. Most of us are not. We like the unity part and we find it gets the difference part. But you need both. Both hold the cosmos together. Both hold the country together. And they're embedded in the land itself and in the seas around it lands. So we start with that, with indigenous spirituality, and then settlers begin to arrive. Some of the settlers were white people who were fleeing what they described as religious intolerance, and some were not. Some were just opportunists or criminals who were in exile. Black people have been here as long as white people. The first black person in the Americas was Free. He was a member of an expedition that went through what we now know as Florida. So here before the Pilgrims, and I want to underscore the importance of black spirituality to this river that we're talking about, this river of American Gnosis. It's a key current that takes many forms, and in the beginning, it took the form of enslaved people coming through the terrible Middle Passage, bringing with them their own traditions, their own rituals, their own ideas and knowings from their indigenous religions in West and Central Africa. Those also were carried by other parts of the diaspora, so we have Afro-Caribbean religion, and we hear a lot of this even today in music. So it's often been said that things like blues and rhythm and blues and rock and roll are endemic to the U.S., which they are. They all evolved from slave songs, taking different directions as time went forward. And if you ever listen to spirituals that go back to the slave days, you will hear the strength of the yearning for freedom. A yearning that has never died out because oppression has never died out. As a result, this tradition of American Gnosis is also musical, which of course it is for indigenous Americans as well. That's a part of it. There's a performative part. There's also a yearning for freedom embedded in the entire tradition. And it's wedded to practical projects. That's another characteristic of American Gnosis. Every now and then you meet some of us who are so possessed by our intuition and so pie in the sky that all we can talk about are the people on other planets or other star systems and how we don't come from Earth and all the rest of it. But that's actually more a shadow side of American Gnosis. It's not really the heart of it. The heart of it is a form of experiential spirituality that never loses touch with practical goals. So the Black Church and its function in helping Black people through slavery, in building community, building relationships, carrying on traditions, conveying practical advice, treating people, healing is a major component of American Gnosis. It's always found in there somewhere. These are all part of it too. So eventually this river grows even larger when other currents get added to it. Transcendentalism in New England. With its nature connection, just like the other currents, nature connection is a part of the river as well. The transcendental philosophers, including Emerson, regarded the world as having its own language that we could understand. Things speak to us all the time, symbolically. And of course, Emerson and the Transcendentalists were also immersed in forms of spirituality from other cultures. Emerson read Hindu sacred texts, so did Thoreau. Thoreau was aware of yoga. So this raises a question: how can this American Gnosis really be unique to the United States? If it's got all these currents from other places, Africa, the Far East, the Southeast, other places too. The U.S. today is one of the most spiritually rich, diverse, variegated places on the planet. So how can this be unique to us? So let's understand what I mean by unique. Now, here's an example. So what we like to call the Japanese tea ceremony, which is really better described as the way of tea. Of course, most of us say, well, it's from Japan, which it is. But the tea came from China. And so did some of the mystery and lore surrounding it. Many centuries ago, of course. So down those centuries, tea masters in Japan evolved a whole set of intricate and reflective and beautiful rituals for preparing and drinking tea. In other words, they took what came from another culture and they made something beautiful that's distinctively Japanese. The way of tea is distinctively Japanese. Likewise, American Gnosis is fed by many different streams, which originate both inside and outside the United States. But the way they blend and are practiced is distinctly American. So I mentioned transcendentalism. It too had a practical component. It's intrinsic to American Gnosis that other people are taken into consideration, and the question of how can we make a better world always comes up. So the transcendentalists were against slavery, and vocally so. They were against the oppression of women, and one of the transcendentalists, of course, was Margaret Fuller, who ran the first journal, The Dial, and was an expert editor and contributed many of her own pieces. She wrote a lot. So she's rightly considered an early American feminist. So there's no separation between spiritual life and practical action. And you see that a little bit later when William James comes along and he calls his philosophy pragmatism, and he translates beautiful passages from Gustav Fechner, who in most psychology textbooks is considered an early physiological psychologist, an experimental psychologist who studied sensory thresholds. But by night, he was a nature mystic, and he wrote about the earth being a vast angel, and he wrote about some of his peak experiences that involved the natural world. And William James translated some of that. So pragmatism has been called a very American philosophy. It's also part of American Gnosis, as is, later down the road, Cornel West's prophetic pragmatism, which he talks about in some of his writings. Another recent example is how elders organized the protests at Standing Rock. Protests which were a deeply spiritual matter. Psychology and healing, even before there was a word for psychology, have been part of American Gnosis as well. In fact, when Jung was putting his version of depth psychology together, he was in contact through the Berg-Hulsey Institute with medical people in Boston who were studying things like dissociation and what we would now call psychodynamic symptoms, psychodynamic cures, right at the very beginning of this, even before Freud's interpretation of dreams was published. People in Boston were aware of all this and working on it. So depth psychology itself may have started in Europe, but it started accompanying by an American version of itself. You've probably heard of American spiritualism, which of course spread to other parts of the world. And there's been spiritualist traditions for time out of mind, but there was a huge interest in it in the United States. William James was interested in it, for instance. It happens a little bit down the road from what's called the First Great Awakening. That was 1720 to 1750, more or less. That was partly informed by splinter groups from Europe who came over for religious freedom, the Quakers, the Pietists, other groups like that. Lots of visionaries. The Second Great Awakening takes place in the 1800s. That's the one that's associated with spiritualism. Other things get going too, like New Thought. Too many to mention. I'm actually writing what's probably going to be a lengthy blog on this topic. And if you get my newsletter, it'll be mentioned in there. I have a monthly events and reflections newsletter. So you can go to my website, chalkwist.com, and get that if you're interested. Or just keep an eye on the blog section of my website. So I'll be having a lot more to say about this. I think that the 1960s were the Third Great Awakening, although they're usually not called that. And of course, there's a shadow side to all this, which I'll go into in my blog. There's a lot of hucksters involved in it. A lot of people who either posed as theosophists or were theosophists and kind of lived on the dark side a little bit. Lots of hucksterism. So we'll hear about that as well. But this tradition is important. It's something that those of us who live here in the United States, regardless of when we got here, can say, yeah, this is homegrown. This is part of the essential experience of being here. American Gnosis could only have happened here. And I think a part of it is the uniqueness of the land and the enormous diversity of its ecosystems. That's part of it. I think some of our optimism and sense of adventure comes from being in this land. There's something spacious about it, even in our language. When you talk to Plains people, they tend to draw out their words, whereas those of us who live on the coast are a little more concise about things. I think the land is even reflected in our speech patterns, certainly in our spirituality. And we can call ourselves members of one of the official religions, Christians, Buddhists, Muslims. Every single religion on the planet is represented here. But they all partake of American Gnosis as well. It's not an either or. So practical, pragmatic concerns, optimism, nature consciousness, yearning for freedom, self-realization, healing, and psychology. These are all essential parts of American Gnosis. And I'll mention one more, which is imagination as a path of knowing. Imagination as a path of knowing. That's there too. Most people who have talked about this down the millennia all over the world distinguish between the kind of imagination that's trivial, that's just making things up or even getting lost in fantasy unhelpfully, and a deeper kind of imagining, a more visionary kind of imagining that lets us tap into new possibilities, go in different directions, imagine things other people haven't quite imagined before in this particular form. And Emerson had something to say about this too. So he said, the fancy takes the world as it stands and selects pleasing groups by apparent relations. The imagination as vision regards the world as symbolical and pieces the emblem for the real sense. And that one comes from his journals. Thoreau is using his imagination when in Walden he said, "Earth is but the outside of Olympus everywhere." To be immersed in American Gnosis consciously is to live in the land of the gods. As an active, assertive, and sometimes even willful participant, taking place in a conversation that ultimately includes the human, but transcends it as well, in a collection, a chorus of many different voices that never stop their singing. or cease in their yearning for the freedom to determine their own destiny. Thank you.